Is everyone on Zoom hearing the voice correctly? Please, can you give confirmations? Thank you. Can everyone hear me well on Zoom and here? Okay. Welcome everyone to our first talk of the semester with Dr. Ahmed Meguid. We are very happy to have you all here to talk about such an interesting topic like the mind-body problem. Everyone who attended our intermediate session to the mind-body problem would probably have an idea about this topic, but I'll leave it to Dr. Ahmed to present. Thank you.
Okay, can everyone hear me now? Okay, very good. So welcome. I didn't expect Ibn Arabi to attract so much audience. I mean, that's Ibn Arabi is mostly like a bowl of salad with lots of dressing on it, so it's very hard to figure out the ingredients of his thoughts. So we will try to do that together. My talk is basically, it will touch on the mind and body problem as the title indicates, but it is not entirely on the mind and body problem. It's mostly on the theory of consciousness and how it contributes to the mind and body problem, but also to very serious problems with metaphysics of objects, and particularly the problem of individuation, at least as it was conceived in the medieval and pre-modern period and even early modern period. So hopefully we'll find that interesting and opening many discussions. I will try to speak on top of my mind, following the outlines that some of you have. If I need to refer to the bigger part of the paper or the extended part of the paper, I will do that. Okay, so what is the mind and body problem, and in what way is it related to the problem of constructing objects and having an understanding or constructing meaning? Well, we go back to the Platonic and the Aristotelian traditions because they are more or less the background against which Arab and Muslim philosophers were writing. So in the Platonic tradition, the mind and body problem is very problematic, simply because Aristotle seems to be always privileging the form or the essence, the universals over the particulars. And that led to many problems in his reception, okay, and to the relationship between those forms and the way they are instantiated, or how particulars participate in those forms. You find that in ancient philosophy, in the Neoplatonic tradition, and so on and so forth. That also led to a problem, very problematic, which is how to identify an individual object, like this chair. If the essence of this chair is the concept of it, which shared with every other chair in the universe, which are essentially infinite, how would you individuate or define a particular chair? Now, Aristotle tried to get out of this problem, and he said, well, form and matter, they are inseparable with each other, and we are going to start with individual objects or substances. And he developed his logic based on the idea of primary substances and the categories that are predicated of the primary substance. But he himself ran into a horrific problem that all Aristotelians know, that the definition of any individual, any primary substance, which he thought was specific enough, they were not as abstract as Plato did, was the species form. So example, for instance, because a real definition for Aristotle is genre plus differentia, you get the species. This is a real definition. So we are all humans. This is this room. I'm assuming there are no aliens or lizards or anything. Okay. So we are all humans. What is the definition of every individual, or the essence of every one of us? We are rational animals. Animals is the genre plus the differentia, that is that which distinguish us from other species. So we are rational animals. Still, that is not enough to individuate. So, and of course, that is one side of it. On the side of the mind and body problem, the relationship between our intellects and or our material intellects. Aristotle had that theory that we start with a potentiality for rationality, but we only actualize our rationality when we get in touch with the immaterial part of our soul. And that immaterial part is our minds, and our minds are completely abstract, and he assumed that minds are completely abstract or immaterial because minds can think all ideas, unlike the senses, which can only get a particular sensation. Say, vision, the eyeball or the eye jelly, as he calls it, can only get the substance, the visual form. The ears can only get the audible form. Skin can only get the tactile form, and so on. So one big problem. So Aristotelians tried to save him. I mean, the book of Metaphysics is a book of problems, aporia, as they called it. And book Zeta, which is one of the biggest disasters of, I mean, it's a genius work, of course, but to unravel it and to get to it, he tried playing with this idea. One, for instance, to give you a small example, Michael Freda, who is one of the leading classicists of the 20th century, he tried to defend the idea of the species form as a basis for individuation by saying that, let us take an example of a ship. And he says, let us say that that ship was dismantled, okay, and its wood was used to build a new ship. The same will have, the two ships will have the same definition, but you can still identify the new ship as a new ship. Why? Because the history actually uses the word history. The history of the previous substance has ended. And there is a new history for the same matter with the same form, even though they share even the same substantial form, that is the same shape of the ship. Okay? But again, I'm not sure if that is very satisfactory, because that again depends on some subjective dimension. That is my recognition as a subject of experience watching those ships and realizing that one has ended and another has begun, or it started a new life, essentially. So one important thing that Arabs did, Arabic philosophy contributed to the history of philosophy of mind and to the mind and body problem, was to try to identify connections between the immateriality or the immaterial nature of the mind and material experience. And one of the, is not the first, but that's just a side note. I'm a bit critical of a lot of scholarship of Islamic philosophy that tends to say that Islamic philosophy sort of started with Avicenna and ended with Avicenna. And this is a big bias, unfortunately, in the Western scholarship on Islamic philosophy. So you have many people, for instance, saying pre-Avicenna and post-Avicenna, as if the whole world centers around Avicenna, which I don't think is true at all. Avicenna is a genius figure, there is no question about that. But there were many brilliant insights that he built upon from Islamic philosophical theology, if you want to call it like that, kalam, ilm al-kalam, or ilm al-aqidah, and philosophical mysticism, التصوف المتفلسف. And also he built on, later on, he got heavily criticized in the tradition in different ways. Even his ideas of modality, for instance, were completely reconstructed. So anyways, that's just a side note. But Avicenna was one of the interesting people who contributed to that. So one of the things that he argued about in his commentary on the Anima is that he added, and not added, but expanded the notion of the internal senses, okay, which are discussed by Aristotle in Sense and Sensibilia, not very much in the Anima, but in other works, but in a very limited way as an animal function. And he didn't give it much attention, even though his theory about the inseparability of matter and form, of concepts and sense data, if you want to put it in modern terms, should require him to do. Anyways, so Avicenna identified 5 internal senses, which were later received and reconstructed in a very interesting way by thinkers like Ghazali, for instance, in Mishkat al-Anwar, the Niche of Lights, and Ma'arij al-Quds fi Madarij Ma'rifat al-Nafs, and many other books, and also Averroes and other thinkers. So what are those 5 senses? The first one is the common sense, al-Hiss al-Mushtarak, which gives you the reception of the substantial forms of an object. Okay, so you see this chair, you see its form, you see its particular form, and then you get al-Khayal, which is a very general term for how you retain that form in your mind. If you are a Kantian or you are familiar with Kantian philosophy, it is sort of the reproductive senses in Kant. It is the way you retain, because if you do not retain the form of that object as you see it from different angles and experience, you are not going to be able to see that object as one unit. Correct? Like, say I saw this chair from one side, and then I looked at it from the back, from this gentleman's perspective. Okay. So if I'm not retaining that in my memory, and my imagination sort of reproduces it, there is no way I can unify it as one object. And then there is the estimative faculty, al-wahm, which is very important. And estimative faculty is the first degree of abstraction, is how we understand the spatio-temporal dimensions of things. So for instance, Al-Ghazali, in his attack on philosophy, he says part of al-wahm is that, or the spatio-temporal structure of our consciousness, that philosophers fall into, mistakes of al-wahm, of the estimative faculty, is that they think that it is impossible okay, to have a moment where there was God and no world, and then God and another world. That is, that God created the world. Okay. Anyways, so it's connected with space and time. And then the fourth level is al-quwa al-hafiza, which is the memory. Okay, not the reproductive imagination, but the memory, which allows you to have an experience in its totality. And last but not least is the one I'm looking for, is the imaginative property. And that one is different from khayal, al-quwa al-mutakhayila. I know that the two terms in Arabic are very similar, but al-quwa al-mutakhayila is really the one that allows you to construct meaning. So you have the content of experience, but then you start thinking about the relationship between that content and concepts and building meanings out of that. Make sense. In other words, build judgments about experience. Okay? So through that, Ibn Sina tried to find the faculty that stands in between the materiality of the senses and their scattered nature, because vision cannot communicate with sounds and so on, and to find a way between the senses that we garner or collect from physical experience and meanings that we construct out of these physical empirical judgments or physical empirical contexts. However, if you think about it, that's not enough. I mean, it's still Avicenna was completely stuck within the Neoplatonic framework. And still he also talked about the importance of the inseparability of retaining the inseparability of the mind. And he even talks, despite his genius developments in modal logic, which was completely underdeveloped by Aristotle and the Aristotelians, and it was due to him and many Arabic logicians that the modal system of logic was very well developed, building on some of the contributions of the Stoics. Despite that, he got completely stuck in that Neoplatonic system. So you get to someone like Averroes a few centuries later. He gets criticized by Ghazali. There is that big fight between Avicenna school and the theology school. Probably some of you have heard of it, of the incoherence of the philosophers. And then Avicennianism immigrates to the West, and you get Ibn Rushd. Ibn Rushd starts also criticizing him deeply and trying to find, as I'm going to show you that Ibn Arabi does in a very interesting way, fulfilling many of the gaps that Averroes left, trying to find an ultimate solution to that mind and body problem, and also an ultimate solution to the relationship between concepts and sense data. Within that, for instance, one of in response to the first problem, Averroes developed the theory of imagination brilliantly in his middle commentary, unfortunately, on the De Anima. Unfortunately, people usually read his grand commentary on the De Anima. And forget about the middle, even though the middle was written after the grand commentary historically. And he also, as far as concepts, he distinguished between concepts that are applicable to experience, and hence they are inseparable from matter, and concepts that are separable from matter and should be completely severed from any claims about experience. And that's a very important need, for a very good reason. One of them at least is freeing science, that you do not logically bind science to essences that you are thinking in abstraction and real definitions. And that, by the way, was a problem that happened in the history of Europe up till the 17th century, that Aristotelian sciences, which was later combined with church sciences and all of that stuff, the idea was that if you know the essence, you do not need experimentation. Hence, someone like Giordano Bruno or Copernicus or any of these astronomers who got burned, okay, they got burned because simply there was a real definition of the moon. And that was the definition in the mind of God. You agree with it? Blasphemy, bye-bye, farewell. Okay, so you are burnt at the stake. So it was important to distinguish between them. Anyways, now let's get to Ibn Arabi and his theory. I'm gonna try to summarize it in the easiest way possible. I have a whole set of quotes for anyone who wants exact textual references, but I don't want to burden you with all of that. So I will try to give you the concise version in as clear way as possible. And then we can, if you want more references, we can talk about that. So what is consciousness in Ibn Arabi? People who have been studying in Ibn Arabi for the last 100 years have been saying that he is a philosopher of consciousness. Someone like Henri Corbin, for instance, a famous French philosopher and very much interested in Islamic philosophy. He wrote about that in The Creative Imagination and the Sufism of Ibn Arabi. The same thing was written by William Chettick, who was arguably the one who most translated Ibn Arabi into English, and he spent a lot of time with Ibn Arabi. But you don't get very much except those comments in their work. I mean, they did amazing. I mean, William Chettick did amazing work as far as translating and tabulating the work of Ibn Arabi, but not much philosophical engagement. Plus, Henri Corbin had his own project, which is a very Shiite-oriented reading of Ibn Arabi, given his interest in Iranian philosophy. The way they understand consciousness, Henri Corbin, for instance, he talks about phenomenology as a tool. And he sort of has, as I put it here in the notes, something like a Thomas Nagel approach. Is anyone here familiar with Thomas Nagel's famous essay, How is it like to be a bat? Which is a kind of a rendering of the, I mean, it is the idea that Nagel was talking about, that phenomenology or consciousness, essentially, phenomenologically understood, is about a particular set of receiving the world and constructing the world from a particular angle. So this is why he calls it what it is like to be a bat. So he said a bat in that sense is a subject, that we can understand its consciousness, okay, given its life and its capacity to fly at night, blah, 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 okay? But we will never be able to understand its structure of consciousness in full, because none of us can be bats and fly at night, as simple as that. So in order, and this is why the phenomenologists talked about phenomenological epoche, reduction, and suspension of the natural attitude in order to understand any particular mode of consciousness. That was the position of Henri Corbin in regards to Ibn Arabi, that Ibn Arabi is talking about a particular mode of consciousness, okay, just like the bat, okay? Now let's go to the other example, okay, which is William Chettick, which is that Ibn Arabi is a philosopher of consciousness in the sense of a phenomenal and understanding of subjectivity and a qualia-oriented, properties-oriented understanding of something. But as I said, neither of them pick up on the idea and develop it. Now, there is another reason or a big challenge in understanding or piecing together the theory of consciousness of Ibn Arabi. Two things, actually. First, his language, which is horrifically impenetrable. He doesn't write like Ibn Rushd, for instance, in clear, syllogistically structured, nice arguments. He writes in a very convoluted way and very poetic way. The other bigger problem, from my humble perspective, is the reception of Ibn Arabi a generation after his death in the Muslim world, particularly during the Ottoman period, by Sufi tariqas or Sufi ways. I think that many of his philosophical intentions got completely lost and got completely reinterpreted in terms of, let's put it like that, very wild interpretations, okay, as Sufis tend to do. I mean, if you look at the immediate followers of Ibn Arabi, someone like Sadr al-Din al-Qunawi, for instance, his son-in-law, or his student Muayyad al-Din al-Jandi, okay, any of these guys, they were very specific, and they clearly saw the distinction between the philosophical insights of Ibn Arabi and and his spiritual experience, which I think is completely individual and should not be discussed unless you are some kind of a Sufi sheikh and you visit Mecca every night in your dreams and stuff like that. Okay, so that is something that should be kept to as Wittgenstein once said, if it cannot be made public, then it is not philosophical. You know what I mean? So it's as simple as that. So this is one side. So what is the theory of consciousness for Ibn Arabi? The theory of consciousness, the catalyst of consciousness, of the construction of our consciousness as representation. As I put it in the title there, I'm going to argue that Ibn Arabi, if you are familiar with that term from contemporary philosophy of mind, is a representationalist philosopher of mind or of consciousness. Okay, he's a representationalist. In other words, he sees consciousness as essentially a function of representation in relation to material existence and mental existence alike. Both of them are representations to him. So what is the faculty that produces these representations? Well, it's imagination. Ibn Arabi distinguishes between 4 layers of imagination. I'm going to talk about 3. The 4th one belongs to that side of him that I think should be left to his individual experience or those who experience such things. The first one is what he calls al-khayal al-mutlaq, absolute imagination. Okay, and absolute imagination, or al-ama' in Ibn Arabi's language, is essentially the world. Think of Arthur Schopenhauer, the world as well and representation. The world for him is really all representation. There is nothing beyond consciousness. And this is why he calls it blindness, al-ama' in Arabic. In other words, it is like the khayal al-mutlaq is like the field of imagination before you slice it with concepts. Imagine like you are a caveman, you don't have language or anything like that. Your consciousness is representing to you that big screen called the universe. Okay, you don't know what it is as of yet. You haven't sliced it. That is al-ama' for Ibn Arabi. That is absolute imagination. And then he gets more specific, and he uses a very, very philosophical word, which is also very Aristotelian. He says al-khayal al-mutahaqqiq, which is al-mufa'al. Sometimes he say al-mufa'al, which is the actualized imagination. And this is the sliced world. Sliced in terms of what? In terms of empirical concepts. So here is a chair, here is a boat, here is a dog, here is a board, here is another human, so on and so on. And then the third level is what he calls the connected imagination, al-khayal al-muttasil. And he calls it connected because it's connected to a particular subject, which is the way you use the 5th faculty that Avicenna talks about, al-mutakhayyila, al-quwa al-mutakhayyila, to construct meaning in the world, to connect content, material content, intuitions, ahdas or hawas. Okay, hats in Arabic with a sin, not with a tha, means intuition and concepts. And then there is the 4th one, which is disconnected imagination, and that I hope everyone is safe. Okay, and that is a particular manifestation of imagination that happens independent of any perspective or any subject. And this one, he connects it with ru'a, real visions from God, or the manifestations of angels to the prophets, like Gabriel manifesting himself to Muhammad as a human, or in his reality as an angel. This is why I said we will not talk about that. This is not a subject of philosophy. So let's leave the 4th, because the first 3 are the ones that concerns us in terms of the construction of consciousness, okay, in the world. So those 4 layers interact, but how do they interact? How does al-khayal, the mutakhayyila of every one of us, construct the world as khayal mutahaqqiq, actualized, universe sliced into different objects and have a sense and understanding of the meaning of these objects? Well, Ibn Arabi gives us a very elaborate theory about the interactions between the faculties of the self or consciousness. So, in a nutshell, you get intuitions which are representations extended in space and time. And I want to say a little bit about that because understanding things fundamentally in terms of spatiotemporal dimensions was a theory that he inherited from the Ash'aris and their atomistic view. And the Ash'aris developed that theory because they wanted to do two things. First of all, they wanted to deny totally, okay, the idea of al-a'yan al-thabita as Platonic ideas that our reason have access to, which the Mu'tazilis, their main opponent in Islam, in the history of Islamic theology, were trying to come up with. And hence the idea that if you understand that, it's very similar to the essences, but they are way mysterious than the theory of essences in Aristotle. You know what is in the mind of God, or al-usul, as the Mu'tazilis, early Mu'tazilis called them. Okay. The other thing is that by reducing the manifestation of objects in the world to just spatio-temporal relations, God can do whatever he wants. And this is precisely the project of Ash'aris. Because unlike the Mu'tazilis were always concerned about the morality of God. This is why they were called Ahlul Adl wa Tawheed, the people of monotheism and justice. Everything with them is about the justice of God. So for instance, we have to have free will, because if we are predetermined, God would be a horrible sadistic being who is judging us for what we were doomed to do. So why worship him in the first place? Because he's not just. Okay. So that is one point. But the Ash'aris want, their main thing was to the power of God, that nothing can interfere with the power of God. And space and time relations for them were, as Abdel Sabra and other scholars have shown, they are representational characteristics. So this is what we get, these intuitions, these sense data, if you want to say, if you want to call them like that, or ahdas, with a seen, as I said, intuitions that we get from our senses, hawas, are related with concepts. Now, what does Ibn Arabi call these concepts or empirical concepts? He calls them the term that he takes from Mu'tazila. This is why at the beginning I told you Ibn Arabi is a big bowl of salad. You read him, you see ayan thabita, you say, oh, he's a Mu'tazili, but he's not. You read him and you see the theory about ahdath and space and time, you think that he's Ash'ari. No, he's not. He pulls elements from many schools and from many philosophers before him, and he redefines them into a completely new system. Okay, so he calls them ayan al-thabita. Now, thubut in the language of Ibn Arabi, as many before him, means mental existence, versus al-wujud al-thabit versus al-wujud al-haqiqi means mental existence versus physical existence. Okay, so these are the concepts in our mind. Now, is the relationship between that content and that concept very clear and direct? Actually not. And he gives you a very interesting example that if you have read in the Science of Interpretation of Dreams or Tafsir al-Ahlam in Arabic, you might have come across it, like the books of Ibn Sirin, for instance, and Nabulsi and others. The example of milk. Milk in the Arabic tradition was in poetry and in dreams seen as a sign of what? Does anyone know? Like if you have a dreams that somebody, a very nice ru'ya just before the Fajr prayer, the dawn prayers, and you go to an interpreter of dreams who read these old books, what will he tell you? Yes?
Seeing the prophets, for example.
If somebody gives you milk, say a prophet gave you milk, what is the milk symbolizing?
Heaven, perhaps.
Get away to, yes?
It's about the being part of the brotherhood.
What brotherhood?
Ibn Arabi has this treatise about the milk and the brotherhood, and from Prophet Ibrahim to Prophet Muhammad, and you become part of this.
Okay, very good. I know what you're referring to, but how do you become? What does he say? How do you become part of that brotherhood? Through what? What will be the milk a representative? Knowledge. Ma'rifah. He talks about it explicitly in the Futuhat, and in that he's following the tradition. When somebody comes and gives you milk, he has given you knowledge. Okay, so he says, let's look at that example. Okay, I have a white substance that is nutritious, and we call it milk. That is the ayn al-thabita of al-laban, or milk. Okay, that is the empirical concept. But in a particular context, I interpret it as a metaphor for knowledge. In another, I simply see it as milk. When I'm awake, when I'm just at breakfast drinking milk. So what he started realizing is that the way we connect intuitions with, or sense data with concepts is very much context defined. And that context is defined by what he called nisab. Nisab are relations that define the different contexts in our world. So for instance, if you are in a theoretical relation that is trying to understand milk as it is, as a substance, you are a scientist, in other words, you will analyze it and figure it out and figure its chemical structure and find out why it is good for you, okay? But if you are thinking of it in terms of other relations, say the relation of beauty, or the relation of compassion, or the relation of mercy, all of the absolutes or the Platonic ideas that define relations in the world, okay, then you will see it in terms of a different thing. And that for Ibn Arabi is the essence of the construction of meaning in the world, the nisab, the relations. What are these nisab for him in the Islamic context? They are the names of God, which he says the Quran told us 99 of them, but the rest we don't know. And this is actually a clear statement in the Quran. Okay, so that's his understanding. Now, of course, he realizes that this doesn't mean that the sky is the limit. I mean, and he talks about bad imagination and bad construction of meaning. He said it has a range, and that range is connected, but I cannot talk about that in detail now, is connected with his theory of possibility, which I'm going to get to right now. So when you connect empirical concept ayn thabita with the sensible content, you get through the relations, what do you get? You get a thing. Now that notion of a thing or shay is a big story. I have a whole chapter about it. because the notion of a thing in the history of Arabic philosophy is fabulously intriguing. Okay, when they started very early on, that is Muslim theologians, and they used thing in a very generic way because it's really the most, and even in the Quran. Okay, for instance, even in the names of God, laysa kamithlihi shay, there is nothing like him. Shay is a very generic term for any object as such. Now, as they started learning Greek philosophy and interacting, they started bringing some Greek terms, and they also started bringing some Persian terms. Okay, so we started having a concept, and one of the most interesting people who tells us this story is Al-Farabi, the famous Arabic philosopher, in Kitab al-Huruf, which is a very interesting account of the development of early philosophical terminology in Arabic philosophy. And he says one of the most important achievements of the early translation movement is that it moved from thing, shape, to mahiyya, essence, and then to gawhar, substance. Okay? In other, Avicenna, actually in his work, he manifests that in earlier works when he was still learning philosophical terminology. And we know that he tried several times to understand the metaphysics of Aristotle, and he failed until he read Al-Farabi's commentary on it, the famous story that he tells and his students tell. And he used to use the word shape, and then he started using the word substance, and then he developed his own, which is al-existent, al-mawgud wal-mahiyya, okay, essences and existences, okay? So essences is his term for concept. So Ibn Arabi had all of that in his hands. and had the whole Abyssinian tradition. And he was a very good reader also of Averroes. But he insisted on things, never changed it. الشيء والشيئين. Okay, and I think that is for a very good reason. Okay, because he wants to completely free himself from any Aristotelian or Platonic interpretation and to insist that this is a matter of representation in al-ama' or consciousness. It is not the Gawhar of Aristotle. Okay, it is not a form and matter. Okay, it's not an essence plus matter, you get an existent. Okay, that essence and matter are all in our consciousness. It's all a matter of representation, in other words. Okay, so he even calls God in one context, if you are familiar with his works, as الشيء في ذاته. He calls God the ultimate thing in itself, which is a very, very interesting move, especially if you have read Immanuel Kant, the Critique of Pure Reason. Okay, and he does it in a very interesting way. He calls God the ultimate thing in itself. Okay, there is a very interesting article about it that just came out. If you are interested, I can share it with you about why Ibn Arabi did that. Okay, so what are those things? Those things, and this is the last point that I'm going to talk about, and then connect the picture together with philosophy of mind and the metaphysics of objects. Those things are essentially possibility. In their essence, they are mumkinat. Why are they mumkinat? Because you can always relate the essence, their concept or ayn thabita with their madda based on the context, which is defined by nisab relations in different ways in your consciousness and construct a different meaning. And of course, he believes that spiritual exercise and development will make you see certain meanings that others cannot, and see within that context multiplicity of the manifestations of the names of God, which define the cosmic relations in a more sophisticated way than others. Okay, but he insisted that everything, that is every actualized object in your consciousness, is a possibility. Now, why I'm stressing this? Because this again is a big can of worms, and it was a fight for almost 500 years, not only in the Arabic tradition, but in the Arabic tradition as it was translated into Latin. Okay, Mr. Avicenna said something that was very provocative to Al-Ghazali, and after him Ibn Rushd, who agree with each other on the criticism of Ibn Sina, that this chair, let's go back to this chair, is in itself a possibility, correct? There is nothing that necessitates its existence. But he said the fact that this chair has assumed that size, these dimensions, that color, and these specific materials means that the necessary existence necessitated it to have that particular form and matter in the world at this particular moment in time and this dimension in space. So in other words, possibilities become necessary through the action of the necessary existent, as that necessary existent actualizes them into being. Okay? Al-Ghazali comes in the third and fourth refutation of the eternity of the world and the incoherence of the philosophers, and he completely blows up this idea. He says nonsense. Possibilities doesn't assume matter at all. And possibilities and possibility necessity, which are the four modal operators, possibility, necessity, actuality, and impossibility, they don't assume matter. Otherwise, this is one of the proofs that they give. Impossibility would also require a matter, which would be a contradiction. And he gives other way more interesting reasons. Okay? And then Averroes comes brilliantly in the grand commentary on the metaphysics, الشروح الكبرى على ما بعد الطبيعة, and he hits Avicenna, and that is immediately echoed in the Latin word. So that, for instance, Averroes' critique is found, you can find echoes of it in Aquinas' critique of John Duns Scotus, for instance, who was very Avicennian. Okay? Aquinas was the more of the Averroist kind, and he hits him on the notion of modality, and he says that things in the physical world continue to be always possibility. This is why, and look at the genius of Ibn Rushd as a man committed to experimental sciences. Okay, and he says they always are possibilities, and they will continue to be possibilities. This is why in the physical sciences, or in the science of physics, we do not need al-burhanul mutlaq. We do not need ultimate demonstration. Okay, so a physicist only needs approximate definitions that he always refines through inductive processes of repeated experimentation, by understanding the possibilities of different concepts and they get actualized in the world. Let me be more specific. You are trying, for instance, to measure the boiling degree of water. Okay, if you assume that that possibility is necessitated, this means that once you find that it's 100 degrees Celsius, there is no way you can change it. And that means that science will be deductive. And Ibn Rushd wants to say, no, this is just a matter of experiment. Maybe on Mars, it will be 90 degrees Celsius. So he says, no, the thing continues to be possible in its essence. It is just actualized to us in that particular way. Okay? So that is a very important move of Ibn Arabi, that he insists that things continues to be possibility. But Ibn Arabi is looking at it from a different perspective than Ibn Rushd. He's looking at it from the perspective of aesthetics and hermeneutics, and the meaning for us in everyday life. He's not scientifically thinking like Ibn Rushd. And he wants to say, as an aesthetician from aesthetics and a poetic thinker, that there is no such thing as an ultimate essence for a thing. Okay, they are all possibilities, and these possibilities are actualized through the process that I just described, the work of the imagination in connecting al-ayan al-thabita with the empirical content or the sensible content that we get from our intuition. Now, in what way, that will be my wrap up. I'm sorry for taking too much of time. In what way does this contribute to the mind and body problem? Well, that extends, as I said, Averroes' arguments in the middle commentary, but in a way more radical form, to construct essentially a theory of representation. And once everything, whether it is material or mental, becomes a representation and a state of consciousness, then you don't have the mind and body problem in the first place. Or maybe you have it, but from a different perspective. But everything becomes representation, essentially. Okay, you don't have that split between the mental and the material. Okay, so that is a very important move. When it comes to the metaphysics of objects, which I see as a very interesting problem related to that, because you cannot separate both of them, Ibn Arabi, at least for the first time in that elaborate way, in the history of Islamic philosophy, gives a brilliant theory for individuating objects. Okay, and within that, or along with that, a theory of hermeneutics, that he allows you not only to individuate things based not only on the material content and the empirical definition or empirical concept, but also based on the context. So he gets out of the context, which is defined by the relations, nisab. And this is why he gets out, or how he gets out of the problem of fixed essences in Aristotle or the Mu'tazili tradition. And with his idea of possibility, which is again inseparable from all of that, he does something that later becomes manifested almost a century in all books of theology, that in the Arabic tradition, they start giving up on cosmological arguments for the existence of God. What do they start looking at more focusedly? The arguments from necessity and possibility. In other words, Ibn Arabi was among the first to say that cosmological arguments, which are mainly taken from Aristotle, the idea that the world is in a state of potentiality, and therefore you have to have something that is in complete actuality in order to pose a first cause, essentially, okay, for the world, is a very weak proof of the existence of God. if there is a proof that is a strictly logical proof about the relationship between necessity and possibility, and it should be completely stripped away from any physical claims. That is, it's logical, it is and seen as a logical foundation for a theory of consciousness, or part of a theory of consciousness. That's it. So I'm gonna stop here, and I think I talked enough, more than 45 minutes. So I'll leave you to ask me questions, and I'm more than happy. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed. We'll be starting first by taking questions from people on Zoom, if there is any.
Hi, sorry, I put my question in the chat that I can say it out loud.
I'll see who is speaking. Is it from Zoom? Okay. Excuse me? No. Okay. I think we're supposed to see people now. Okay, here's Ewan. Okay, hi.
Whoa. Do you want me to ask my question?
Yes, if you don't mind, because I
okay. Sorry, I put my question in the chat. Okay, so it was just a question of a clarificatory question.
Okay, sure.
So you might be able to deal with this quite quickly.
Okay.
So yeah, so you gave an example of a scientist looking at milk, experiencing milk, right? That was an example which was trying to bring out how Ibn Arabi connects intuitions with concepts through context.
Yes.
You gave this example. So what I'm wondering is, does this mean that the way that context determines that connection, right, that context, is interest relative, right? It's because the scientist has certain scientific interests in finding out the properties of milk or whatever, that they experience the milk in the way that they do.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't call it interest, but I would call it purposively or purpose-oriented. Absolutely. And Ibn Arabi is also very careful. In other words, Ibn Arabi is not a relativist. He's not saying like, okay, let's open up for whoever wants to think about anything. He says there is bad imagination, and he calls it illusion. Okay, that's tawahum. Okay, that you can understand something in a particular way. But you are definitely right in saying that it depends on the orientation, a specific orientation in experience. If I want to know something, versus say if I am experiencing or having an aesthetic experience or a moral experience or a spiritual experience. Mm-hmm. So yes, it is. I would just use purpose rather than interest.
Yeah, because I mean, I think, you know, one worry that I had about that kind of way of conceiving of experience was, yeah, if it was if it was to do with interests, you know, you might just think, well, you know, whether or not I'm a scientist or just, you know, or I could be a farmer, or I could be just, you know, some person, you know, what I see is the same thing, right? Is one thing. What I see is, you know, some white substance in front of me. And then on the other hand, you know, what I know about it, right? Some knowledge that I have about this substance is another thing, right? Maybe these are two different things, right?
Yeah, I mean, he also puts a lot of constraints when it comes to sensible qualities of a certain thing. So for instance, he says nobody can say take a part of the characteristics of milk, which is that it's a nutritious substance, and then say that milk is black, for instance. That would be nonsensical. He says so.
Right.
So he wants those a'yan al-thabita that I called empirical concepts to be very well grounded in experience. He doesn't want, but he then understands that there are certain domains of the construction of meaning, and hence the relationship between sense data and concepts that are more hermeneutical. And he wants to understand those. But he's, for instance, he never objects. I mean, and this is again another big fallacy in Kant scholarship. He never, many Sufi scholars claim that he was against philosophy. The guy was never against philosophy. He's explicit in Futuhat al-Makkiyah, in the Meccan revelations, that philosophy has its uses, but then he's talking about different aesthetic and other domains that come after that. He's clear about that philosophy has its uses and science has its uses. Mm-hmm. So he doesn't, but he wants to say that, which I think is a position that nowadays taken by many phenomenologists and critics of science, that science is not that absolute as we think it is. I think this is what he's getting at. Especially that, of course, at his time, science was essences and Aristotelianism, which was, as I'm sure you know, very restrictive form of science.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're more than welcome.
There is another question by Dr. Switzer. Please go on.
Yes, I don't know if you can see me. My camera seems to have disappeared. Basically, first of all, I wanted to thank Ahmed very much for an excellent talk, a nuanced account of what is clearly a very nuanced philosophy. And, you know, you've stirred in me a hunger to learn more, which is, I think, what this kind of thing is all about, what teaching is all about. And so, you know, I really do thank you for that. Much of this was very clear, very interesting, but I think, you know, obviously this is part of a larger project, and one of the things you ended with, I found very, you know, interesting, but a bit puzzling. Let me just first say what it is, which is the idea that with representation, as is understood here, there is no longer a split between the mental and the material. Before you answer what you mean by that, any talk of representation for me brings to mind Descartes, and you know, as you know very well, Descartes speaks of these ideas or representations in his mind and is bedeviled, you might say, by the concern that there is no real way to establish that there is something outside the mind that causes and is similar to the ideas that I have within my mind. And he ends up in this state of solipsism and perplexity, and needs to find a way out, which he finds, of course, through proving God's existence. So, you know, it's an interesting sense it's an interesting direction to go in, to say that somehow this theory of representation just, you know, eliminates that entire problem. But I'd love to hear more about how that is the case.
Okay, well, that's a very good question and challenging one as well. So I wouldn't say eliminate entirely, but maybe recast it in a different way. The way I would think of, the way I think of representations in Ibn Arabi is along the lines. Oh, here you are. We can see you now. Hi. So the way I was thinking of representations are more along the lines of Kant's Vorstellungen, rather than Descartes' clear and distinct ideas, and for a very good reason, that Ibn Arabi would say that mental and physical representation, which are part of that, as I tried to explain at the beginning, that totality of consciousness that we then start slicing with our empirical concepts as we go on, they may be coming from something that we logically recognize that there is a necessary existent, so that we can give us some kind of a logical assertion that those intuitions and concepts are are representative of something that is real, okay? But for him, at the end of the day, the reality is the way we construct these things in a consistent way in different contexts. Now, why I'm likening it to Kant? Because for both of them, and I'm sure, I know we have, I hope Professor Fincham and other scholars of Kant are here. Both Kant and Ibn Arabi do not resolve the problem of metaphysical skepticism, as we all know. I mean, Kant may have resolved the problem of inductive skepticism, but he never resolved the problem of metaphysical skepticism because of the thing in itself, which we do not know really what it is. I mean, at the end of the day, everything is a Vorstellung. Okay, and yes, we can trust that mutuality between intuitions and the way they are harmonized with the senses, as much as the deduction is. I'm sorry if I'm talking too Kantian, through the deduction of the categories of the understanding, but I'm not sure if that is it resolves ultimately, as Russell and many of the later thinkers have pointed out, that it ultimately resolves the problem of metaphysical skepticism. Where do these representations come from? Because at the end of the day, space and time, and I meant to talk about that, are also parts of our consciousness, according to Kant. They are mind dependent rather than mind independent. So I think this is why I like to think of him if I find a modern analogy, I like to think more of Kant, because he has that same problem of metaphysical skepticism. But of course, Kant was concerned about scientific facts and responding to Humean skepticism and giving a ground for causality. Ibn Arabi was not concerned about that at all. He was concerned about layers of hermeneutics along the lines of someone like Heidegger, for instance, or any of these phenomenologists and existentialists. So I hope I answered your question. I don't think it's a very satisfactory answer, but I don't think he manages to resolve the problem, because I think your question is really about that. It's about metaphysical skepticism.
Yeah.
And I think that for him, it's all, this is why Henri Corbin was right. I mean, Ibn Arabi's theory of consciousness is a mundus imaginalis. It's the world is that constructed. It's a constructed world according to the functions of our imagination.
No, really very helpful. It makes a lot of sense, the way that you framed it. And I can see that the Cartesian frame is not the best way to approach this. So no, that's wonderful. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions from our Zoom audience? Can you check the chat? I think not. So we can go on to our face-to-face audience. If there are any, oh, yeah, Dr. Stephens. So can you please go ahead?
Oh, Dr. Stelzer is here. Oh, wow.
Yeah, I was surprised as well.
Okay. He's the first one who taught me Ibn Arabi, so ages ago.
Like to give a talk.
Yes, I feel intimidated now that he's
Dr. Stelzer, can you please open your mic and ask your question, if possible? I suppose maybe there's a problem with Zoom.
Okay, you hear me now?
Oh, yes. Yes.
All right. Yeah, I have a question. That lady that sits in the front, one of the students, I guess, she asked you about milk. You remember?
Yes.
Yeah, and you said milk is a symbol of knowledge or for knowledge. But she said something about the brotherhood. I don't know where she got the idea from, but it's, I think, quite relevant here. Why? There is a passage in one of the texts of Ibn Arabi about the brotherhood of milk. Just a second. I'm sorry. Oh God, now it's gone. I'm sorry to hold the whole thing up. Just a second. Yeah. Okay. All right, here. Brotherhood of Milk. You know, that I don't remember exactly the title of the text, but it's the text of Ibn Arabi's about a journey, how to travel in terms of knowledge. And he says here, and I just take the quote out of Stephen Hertenstein's article about the Brotherhood of Milk, that Abraham asks the follower, "Who is the stranger with you?" And the follower replies, "He is my brother." "Your milk brother or your blood brother?" Abraham asks. "My water brother." The follower replies, "You are right," Abraham says. "This is why I do not recognize him. Do not keep company with anyone except your milk brother, just as I am your milk father." And so it goes on. I don't want to hold you up too much, but it seems to me that the matter of the milk is not only a matter of knowledge, but of a particular kind of knowing and way of knowing, which is connected precisely through, let's call it brotherhood or relationship. Here, the brotherhood, or the Abrahamic one. So that is something I think that should be taken into account here for the whole talk, if I may recommend this. That is to say, we are always hearing about knowing by yourself and through yourself and so on. But one of the things that Ibn Arabi brings into the whole game, and very importantly so, is that knowledge, or the process of knowledge, or the travel of knowing, is a travel of a community, of being with someone. And the whole text that this quote was taken from describes precisely that. So it's not just knowledge, but it's also knowing with one, or knowing through whom. So the girl that made this remark about brotherhood, I think, and milk, said something very important. Do you have any idea regarding this, or would you dismiss this as unimportant altogether?
Oh, well, thank you very much. That's a great comment. And your name, please? Okay. Okay, so I think you know each other. So, well, do you want to talk to him?
Oh, this is me, Dr. Stelzer. Basma.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, okay, Basma. Well, I didn't talk with her before the talk, all right.
Okay, so let me respond to your very important remark. And actually, your remark proves my point, actually, that I used milk only in a very limited way to talking about how the substance of milk is connected with with its concept within a particular context determined by relation. And I also, by relations or nisab, which are the names of God. And I also said that Ibn Arabi, as you kindly pointed out, understands that you elevate, you keep on going, you keep on developing how you construct that connection between sensations or material intuitions and concepts based on different contexts. So the example that you talked about, which is the idea of brotherhood and community, or suhbah, to use the Sufi term, is definitely something that is a higher level of understanding milk than the basic scientific level, or even the poetic interpretation of it in a dream as a sign of knowledge. So I completely agree with you. Your point is actually showing that it's your interpretation, I should say, is a more sophisticated spiritual level of complexity. So I completely agree with you.
All right, we talk about it.
That the connection is contextual in Ibn Arabi's mind, as I said.
Yes. All right. I'm happy for the time being.
I want you to be always happy, Professor Shazza.
Let's go back to the people who are attending your talk, maybe.
Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry if there's anybody else from the participants.
Thank you, Dr. Stelze, for your important remark. Are there any other questions from the Zoom audience again? Okay, we can go on to the audience questions. Are there any questions? It's an important question because it's coming from Khalid Hamza, the academics chair of the association. So everyone should have high expectations to the sense.
No, now I'm worried.
Please don't have high expectations. Building on Dr. Switzer's question and your response about the metaphysical skepticism that is emanating the works of both Kant and Ibn Arabi. I know that Mullah Sadra is the later systemization of the philosophy of Ibn Arabi, and he is a proponent of the precedence of existence over essence. Given this and given theories like Al-Ama and the presentation and the Nisab, which all point out some way or another to the primacy of the existing thing in itself, God before the consciousness, doesn't that really implicitly help us overcome this skepticism some way or another, given that God is there?
Can you please repeat the last part? I lost you in the last part.
So given that, given the theories of Al-Ama or the presentation in general and Nisab and the primacy or the direct intervention of the names of God in this whole process of conceptualization and slicing, starting with Al-Ama, doesn't this give primacy to the existing thing in itself before conceptualization, before slicing? Implicitly, doesn't that help us as human beings overcome this skepticism? I'm not sure. I'm just asking this question is generally.
Very important question. There are two sides to it. So first of all, my own personal opinion, and you are more than welcome to disagree with me. No, I actually do not think that Mullah Sadra Mullah Sadra was a specific reception of Ibn Arabi within a particular Iranian tradition of Irfan, which read Ibn Arabi in a particular way. Like, for instance, the example that you have given, that existence precedes essence. As a matter of fact, if you read Ibn Sina, the man who was responsible for the term, he actually gave precedence to essence over existence, the opposite one. So I am very critical of that whole tradition. I'm not saying that they are great philosophers, but I have many criticisms of Mullah Sadra and Mim Bakr Damad and that whole Iranian Ishraqi tradition. But of course, they are very important interpreters or not. As for your question about whether or not Al-Ama and the intervention of the names of God is enough, it might be enough from a theological perspective, but of course it's not enough from a philosophical perspective. Philosophy wants a real foundation in for these representations, and this is why, for instance, the Ding an sich for Kant isn't, I mean, people say, fine, is it an epistemic postulate? I mean, you will get into the same problem of representation. So it might be theologically for someone who believes in God, or for a 17th century thinker like George Berkeley or Descartes, who whenever they got stuck, or 18th century, whenever they got stuck, they always went to God. But it's not enough from a scientific perspective, I would say. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Because
I think we have the gentleman here. So. Yeah.
It's working. The question isn't really about Ibn Arabi, it's more about the whole Aristotelian hail and form. So for Aristotle, for example, he understood matter not as we did. He understood that it was like, it didn't have dimensions when it's like in pure, without form. So And
You
I also-
mean the material substratum, the hue?
yes, yes. He thought that it was eternal, therefore, like the eternity of the world.
Yes.
So my question is that he said that you can't separate hail and form, for example. They're always together.
Matter and form, yes.
Yes. So, but then you have people like Ikhwan al-Safa, for example, or Ismailis. They said that no, there is like there is a way that one. No, there is not a way. There exists pure form and pure hail. For example, they said they used the Neoplatonic theory of the all soul, the universal soul, and first hail.
Which is Neoplatonic, by the way.
Yeah, Neoplatonic, yes, exactly. And Ibn Arabi also used like a very similar.
Oh yes, he used Neoplatonic terms, but he reconstructed it in his
Yes.
own way.
Yeah, the same thing with the Ikhwan al-Safa, they also reconstructed.
Of course, there's no question.
My question is that the Ayan al-Thabita I have read somewhere, I'm not sure if this source is reliable or not, but it said that they are like a potential, they are not potentially, but they are things that hear the command of God and then actualize the thing. So is that similar to how the hail, for example, is actualized by the first mover in Aristotle?
Repeat the last part. It seems very interesting. This is what I want to make sure I understood.
Just have to. Okay. My question is that, for example, we have by Aristotle that form is hail gets the form from the unmoved mover.
Exactly.
And by Ibn Arabi, I assume from the source that I have read, said that العيان الثابتة, they actualize their potential by the command of God. So is the pure hail of Aristotle similar to the عيان الثابتة of Ibn Arabi?
I think this is it's a very interesting idea, but I don't think that the way I understand Ama as the field of consciousness, as I and al-ayan al-thabita, because al-ayan al-thabita are just the concepts of things. They are actual, and this is why I call them empirical concepts. And William Shattuck, one of the most important interpreters of Ibn Arabi, he makes the same position in Sufi Path of Knowledge, one of his major works, and he repeats it again in Ibn Arabi's cosmology, that al-ayan al-thabita in Ibn Arabi are the way he took them from the Mu'tazilis and redefined them, are very much pushed downwards. They are relegated in importance. They are just empirical concepts. If there is anything that is really a Platonic idea for Ibn Arabi, it is the names of God as they manifest themselves, defining the relationship between material representations and conceptual representations or concepts. So I wouldn't make that. I think your position or your analogy would work better if you think about al-ayan al-thabita as the way Mu'tazilis thought about it. And the Mu'tazilis were definitely closer to the Ismaili tradition than Ibn Arabi, way closer to them. So.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. Are there any other questions from the audience?
From my understanding, I always get the idea that for Ibn Arabi, al-ayan al-thabita is things as they are in the knowledge of God before they come to exist, and they are closely connected to the divine names. I can't think of an exact passage right now, but this is the idea that I find predominant in his writing. And I also have another question. He uses the word shay, and he uses the word ayn, and ayn is supposedly essence. But he uses it for the creature as well, humans, for example. So he says, for example, إنه لابد من إثبات عين العبد, the essence of the human has to be confirmed in order for he explains why at the end of the chapter, at the end of the passage. Can you explain the difference between shay and ayn?
Okay, let's start with the first part, the one about al-ayan al-thabita. You say that they are the concepts in the mind of God. The question, in order to understand that question, we have to first understand how do we access God for Ibn Arabi. And that's a big question, okay? Ibn Arabi is clear, and this is another maybe intersection between him and Kant, that الذات is numinal, is unknown. This is why he calls God الشيء في ذاته, the thing in itself. You can never access what is really in the mind of God. So he's actually way more humble than the Aristotelians, for instance. Aristotelians thought that when you are connecting with the active intellect, you are becoming divine, like Ibn Sina, for instance. And the Neoplatonists. So he's clear about that. So when he says they are in the mind, what we know, what they are for God is how they are framed by the power of the names, which define the context, the relations. So hence they are, as I said, empirical concepts. They are the concepts of the thing. So he accepts the theory of definitions of Aristotle, but in a very qualified way. That they are just empirical definitions. They are not real definitions. They don't capture the essence. And there is a whole history behind that in Arabic philosophy. Now, if you read, for instance, مجرد مقالات الأشعري of Ibn Arabi. Thank you. مجرد مقالات الأشعري of Ibn Arabi. There is that critical attitude towards a theory of real definitions or essences. So when you say in the mind of God, you have to be very careful which maqam of God. And that is maqam al-uluhiyya. God as the divine creator of the world, to which we have access to him as the necessary existent. And even the necessary existent is a logical idea that is abstract. Can you please turn that thing off? It is turned off? Okay. So there is no such thing as in ontologically or metaphysically in the mind of God for Ibn Arabi. This is what I'm saying. Because Ibn Arabi is clear that the that is unknown. And this is one of the big misunderstandings or misinterpretations of his language, that people do not put everything together. So when he say al-ayan al-thabita, the concepts that we have access to, just like we humans, through our consciousness, have access to in that big frame of representation. Okay? There is very interesting discussion of that by Abu al-Ila Afifi. I'm sure you are familiar with his work and other people. But it is different than the Mu'tazili construction of al-ayan al-thabita, which is actually ontologically in the mind of God, just like Aristotle. So as I said before in response to the previous question, the Mu'tazilis are closer to the Aristotelian idea more than Ibn Arabi. Ibn Arabi is a representationalist nominalist. You don't have access to the that of God to know what is in his mind. Fair enough. Well, this is precisely what I'm talking about. And the sifat define the context in which those empirical concepts of things, as they are manifested to us in the ama, are related to the empirical content. Mish how they are essentially as an absolute essence in the mind of God. That's a radical difference. Now, what was the other side, part of your question? Yeah, shay and ayn are used interchangeably sometimes in his language, but shay is a more general term for representation as it is constructed in ama as a mumkin, but ayn is mutahaqqiqa. It is a particular object that I see. Mutahaqqiq means that it's actualized in front of me. Okay, so it's very close. But shay is a more general term. But when he discusses the general theory of his, or the way consciousness is, he always uses shay. And I think that's a brilliant move, because he has the whole baggage of Avicenna, Averroes, and the Mutakallimun before him, and he wants to distance himself. Remember, he was also a master of Arabic language. So he wanted to stick to the language of the Quran, and the Quran uses shay. It doesn't use gawhar or mahiyya. So that's another reason why he uses it. You're welcome. Oh, thank you. Is this the pose of this? You think, okay. Well, thank you all for listening.